Hey there, my name is Mick. I'm one of the pastors from West Beach Community Church. And I don't know how you found your way here with us today, but however it was, I'm really glad you did. And I must admit, for someone talking about myself here who's about as technological as a brick, I'm really starting to appreciate how, although we find ourselves quite isolated from each other these days physically, technology is actually allowing us to speak to one another and to listen to one another as we all try to figure out how to live and care for our neighbor under these really hard circumstances that the coronavirus has all of us living under at the moment. The coronavirus has us in times of the unknown. And I think for many of us, if we're honest, these moments and these times we're living in now are really clouded with anxiety, with stress, and with fear. And today is why we spend this little bit of time together. I actually want to share a story with you. But before I do, I want to ask all of us a question. And it's a rather simple question, but it's also a rather confronting one. And the question is simply this: have you ever been hurt? And I mean a deep hurt. I'm not just talking about a physical injury or a physical hurt, but I'm talking about a hurt that is emotional, that is spiritual, that is a deep hurt that hurts you and gets to you right at the very core of your soul. Now, these deep hurts that many of us are thinking about right now, I would bet the very small amount of money that I do have, that these hurts, the vast majority of them for all of us, I would bet they have one thing in common. And that is that these deep hurts that we all share have come from a relationship in which you felt great love, but then great betrayal. It hurts most when the hurt is inflicted by someone we love, right? There's an unknown writer who said it well, I think, when they wrote, "The saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemy." And I would like to share a story with you right now about such hurt, but it's also a story with not just hurt in it, but it has much love in it as well. Now, this is a story about an extremely dysfunctional relationship between two people. And you might or you might not have heard of these people, and their names are Hosea and Gomer. And if you're not familiar with this story, you'll see as we go along that it's a pretty full-on, it's a pretty shocking story. And it's a story which is found in the Old Testament of the Bible. And it's a book which is called, surprise, surprise, Hosea. Now, I said this story is shocking, and God's very, very first words to Hosea are shocking indeed. Get this, God's very first words to Hosea are, "Go and marry a prostitute." But you didn't expect that, did you? But it doesn't actually stop there. God then sort of ups this challenge to Hosea. And he says to Hosea, okay, so you're going to go and marry this prostitute, and her name is Gomer, okay? And then he tells Hosea that Gomer is actually going to leave him. But God says, but when she does, you, Hosea, are to go after her. Even if she's unfaithful to you, you are to pursue her and you are to love her still. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. Gomer is actually unfaithful to Hosea. We know if you go read the whole story of Hosea, we see that Gomer has 3 children. And we only know for sure that one of them is Hosea's. But after they have those 3 children together, Gomer actually gets up and she leaves Hosea. She leaves him. But the story gets worse still, because Hosea does what God tells him to do, and he actually goes after Gomer like God told him to do. But when Hosea actually finally catches up with her, when he actually finds his wife, he actually finds her living with another man. And at this point in the story, we get to this point in the story, and it's clear that Gomer has fallen far. Because on top of all of this, on top of the fact that, the way that she's lived and the way that she's left her husband and she's shacked up with this other guy, Hosea is actually now told by this other guy, when he finally gets there and says, hey, that's my wife, I want her back. He's actually told by this other guy that he can have her back if he is willing to buy her off him. So Gomer has fallen far, I said, because she's basically become the property of this other guy who she's entered into a relationship with. So the story goes like this. Gomer, Hosea actually having found his wife again, somehow minds to get together the necessary amount of money. And he does. He goes and buys her back off this guy. So he buys her back, and then Hosea and Gomer, they head back together, back home, to try to restore this relationship that had been so broken. Now, up to this point in the story, we can actually say there is so much wrong with this story. It's a sad and tragic tale up to this point. And firstly, we have women being bought and sold as possessions. Then we have things like adultery, and then we have things like slavery. There's a lot happening in this story. There's a lot wrong with it. But I don't want to get distracted by those things now, as important and as a bigger topic as they are individually. Because what I want us to try to do today is actually, I want us to look at the whole story of Hosea and what it is actually saying to us. I want us to sort of zoom right out and look at this story as a complete message from God to his children, because that's what it is. Or another way you might want to look at it is, what is actually God saying to humanity as we are his children? And I think to do that, we need to understand who the characters of this story are actually supposed to represent. You see, each character in this story represents someone. Can you see that? Hosea represents someone. Hosea represents God. And he represents God because in this story, Hosea is someone representing God in the sense that he is almost stubbornly seeking out relationship with Gomer. And that's exactly what God does with his people. And like Gomer, despite the way that God's people have treated him and have been unfaithful to him over and over again throughout history, God still seeks them out because of his love for them. And Gomer represents Israel, the nation of Israel, who are actually God's chosen people. And Gomer reflects the faithless Israel, who actually historically have ran away from God since the beginning, and they've turned their back on him over and over again. So in our story, we have an adulterous wife in Gomer as the adulteress Israel. And we also have the faithful husband as Hosea, as a faithful God. That is who they represent. Now this story, it's confronting, isn't it? There is enough pain and emotion in this story already. I can't even begin to imagine how I would actually react in such betrayal in my own life. I would be absolutely broken. I would be absolutely shattered. And likely, if I'm very honest, very bitter as well. So if you look at this story, surely now would have been an acceptable time as ever for God to actually decide to turn his back on Israel and say, bah, no, enough is enough. I won't be treated like that. That would be, a fair enough way to finish this story, but the story doesn't end like that. You see, in chapter 11 of this story of Hosea, God actually responds directly to Israel. And his words are incredibly moving. And I want to just read to you a section out of that chapter right now. This is what it says in Hosea 11. And this is God speaking to the nation of Israel. This is God speaking to his people. He says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk." Ephraim was another word they would use for Israel in those days. And then he says, "I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them. My people are bent on turning away from me. And though they call out to the Most High, he shall not raise them up at all. How can I give you up, O Ephraim?" Remember, that's Israel. "How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not a man." What we have here is language of a loving parent to their precious children. He says, when Israel was a child, I loved them. God gives more with these images. He offers more of these images of a loving parent to their child, with illustrations in that chapter of firstly of a parent who taught their children to walk. He also talks about a parent taking their child up into their arms, leading and guiding them with kindness and love, and bending down to feed them and to nurture them. And then God cries out, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? And then he finishes with, I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not a man. God is different to us in many ways. He's so similar in some ways. God, like us, has that desire to love and that desire to forgive. But here in the story of Hosea, it's not just the desire to love and the desire to forgive that we see and hear, but we actually see God do this. In our story about Hosea and Gomer, God forgives what many of us could not forgive or have not forgiven. And we also see God loves those people who are sometimes so difficult for us to love. Some compare or some liken the story of Hosea and Gomer to another story, which has the name The Prodigal Son. And this is another beautiful story about a father who actually forgives his son after his son has publicly abandoned, publicly shamed and disrespected his father greatly. Now, the story of the prodigal son is often sort of the story used to demonstrate the love of God, and rightly so, because it's a beautiful story and it's a very moving story. But I think the story of Hosea today that we've looked at and listened to goes even further than the love we see in the story of the prodigal son. You see, in the story of the prodigal son, it's actually the son who eventually he decides that he needs to go back to the father. And he eventually goes back to his waiting father. But you see, in the story of Hosea and Gomer never does such a thing. She never decides that she wants to reconcile and be forgiven and go back into relationship. She never runs back to Hosea, does she? It is actually Hosea who is representing God, who doesn't just wait for Gomer to return to him, but Hosea representing God. He actually goes after her. He seeks her out. He finds her. And he pays the price for her life. And he restores her back to himself. And that is God's love for humanity right there. We as people might have lost our way and tried our best to desert God. But we know through the story of Hosea and the story of the prodigal son, and it actually talks about in this, also in one of the Gospels called Luke, that God is one who came to seek and to save the lost. And I think when I read these stories, especially the story of Hosea and Gomer, I think it's these stories that give me hope. And hope that even in times like these where fear and the unknown are actually dominating our minds and dominating our conversations, that hope which I mentioned that remains is because I think we see that our Creator God, He actually pursues us. He is for us despite the conditions we're living under right now. He is with us and He loves us. And He is constantly calling us back into relationship with Him. I just want to say, before I say bye to you guys at the moment, that if you are alone and if you are struggling during these times, or if you just need someone to talk to, then please feel free and feel welcome and feel invited to actually get in touch with us through an email or through a phone call. And our email and our phone number is all accessible at our website, which is westbeachcommunity.church. Because I would just add, in times like this, we need each other more than ever. And we want to be there for you, and we want us to be there for each other. Thanks for stopping by. I'm glad we could share this story today. And just take care of yourselves and take care of each other. And we're here for you. God bless.